Hey, this is Dr. Ben Weitz, host of the Rational Wellness Podcast. I talk to the leading health and nutrition experts and researchers in the field to bring you the latest in cutting-edge health information. Subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast for weekly updates. And to learn more, check out my website, drweitz.com. Thanks for joining me, and let's jump into the podcast. Hello, Rational Wellness Podcasters. Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Bryan, one of the world's leading experts on nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a molecule that plays a critical role in circulation, energy, brain health, immune balance, even sexual function. Unfortunately, most people begin to lose their ability to make nitric oxide as they age. We'll dive into what nitric oxide is, why it matters, and the best strategies to boost your levels naturally and clinically. Dr. Bryan is an internationally recognized scientist and leading expert in the field of nitric oxide research. He spent the last 2 decades studying the biochemical pathways of nitric oxide and its impact on human health, including cardiovascular health, immune function, and healthy aging. Dr. Bryan has published numerous peer-reviewed papers, authored books on nitric oxide, and has developed innovative products to restore and optimize nitric oxide production. Dr. Bryan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Great. So what is nitric oxide and why is it so important?
Well, it's what we call a signaling molecule. It's how cells in the body communicate with one another. It's a neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. It's a molecule produced by our immune cells that kill bacteria, prevent virus from replicating. And then, it's a vasodilator, meaning that it dilates the smooth muscle surrounding all blood vessels, thereby improving circulation, blood flow, oxygen delivery. It's a signal that tells our own stem cells to mobilize and differentiate so we can repair and replace dysfunctional cells. It activates our mitochondria, so it's critically involved in energy production inside the cell. And, it activates an enzyme called telomerase, which prevents our telomeres from getting shorter. So when we look at the hallmarks of aging, nitric oxide really addresses all aspects of aging.
One of the things that's amazing is you give me that litany of accomplishments, and I'd say, well, this person who did all that must be 100 years old. And yet nitric oxide is a gas that sometimes lasts for less than a second. So how can it accomplish all those roles when it's not around for very long?
Well, that was what we tried to solve more than 25 years ago, because when I started in the field in the late 90s, nitric oxide was recognized as a gas. And once it's produced, it's gone in less than a second. So the challenge in the field was, okay, when nitric oxide is produced, where does it go? What does it become? And how does it signal?
Okay.
And once we created this fingerprint of NO biology, then we could see what were the relevant metabolites, the second messenger systems that were activated once nitric oxide is produced. And, today we certainly know when nitric oxide is produced, it can activate second messenger systems like guanylyl cyclase, increase cyclic GMP, lead to calcium-dependent smooth muscle relaxation. It can bind to proteins, or these metabolites can modify cysteine residues on proteins and affect protein structure and function. It can, change DNA methylation, so epigenetic regulation. So it's involved in many important and foundational biological processes.
So this gas produces metabolites that then last longer, that can have an effect in terms of signaling and affecting all these different organ systems.
That's exactly right. And so what we were trying to figure out was, when you have an adequate production and sufficient production of nitric oxide, what does those metabolites look like in the blood, in the saliva, in actual tissue? And then how do these second messenger systems, what's the half-life of them, and how do they signal? And then what happens in people who develop disease and are nitric oxide deficient? And what we find, we published on this back in 2004, that fingerprint looks completely different. There's a different set of metabolites, typically lower. There's these different, nitrogen oxides that form. And, when you have more oxidative stress and less nitric oxide, then that leads to oxidative stress and, the hallmarks of aging and chronic disease.
What are some of the most important metabolites?
Well, when nitric oxide is produced, it can bind to the cysteine of glutathione, So it reacts with oxygen and can form these higher ion oxides like inorganic nitrite, which then, the circulating half-life of nitrite is about 110 minutes. So sometimes we get 2 hours or more. When it binds to the cysteine of glutathione, which is a tripeptide, it can survive in the circulation out for hours. And then, it binds to other cysteine residues on proteins or peptides and even amino acids like cysteine. So then it activates, binds to metals and can be transported as a nitrosyl heme and activates, soluble guanylate cyclase, which then increases cyclic GMP production, which causes smooth muscle relaxation. And, when we look at the PD5 inhibitors, they prevent the breakdown of cyclic GMP, and that's why they're effective for improving erections in men, because it leads to enhanced vasodilation.
Interesting. So can any of these metabolites be measured? Because I know that being able to measure nitric oxide is tricky, right? We don't really have good methods. I know you developed a saliva test, but that's not necessarily a great measurement either, correct? I think I've heard you say.
Yeah, clinically, there's really not. In the research environment, we have some pretty sophisticated analytical equipment where we can measure, inorganic nitrite and nitrate and measure the amount of nitric oxide bound to cysteine thiols or bound to metals. And that's how we mapped out this nitric oxide metabolome. But clinically, it's not utilized. But 15, 16 years ago, I developed a salivary test strip just to give us a sense of what may be going on with these different metabolites that are recycled and produced in our saliva. And I think it's still probably a good tool to have in your toolbox, but I've gotten away from those test strips because there's a lot of false positives. There are no false negatives. So if your saliva tests low in inorganic nitrite, which is what we're measuring, then it tells us that your ability to produce and recycle nitric oxide is compromised. But if it shows optimal or normal, that doesn't always an accurate interpretation. We're finding that people with active oral infection, whether it's a symptomatic or even an asymptomatic infection, turn that test strip bright pink, and it's reflective of a local immune response dealing with an infection rather than systemic nitric oxide production. Okay. So that's what we have to parse out, and I think there can be misinterpretations of those test strips. So I don't use them anymore.
Are there any blood tests, or are we close to having a blood test to measure nitric oxide?
Yeah, look, we've published on this for the past 30 years. So, we do it in the research environment. Now, whether it's ever going to be utilized clinically as a relevant and useful biomarker, I think the jury's still out, because what we're finding is that, these metabolites can be influenced by diet, right? When we consume green leafy vegetables, the nitrate's converted to nitrite. We see an increase in plasma levels of that. So, but that's not reflective of endogenous kind of endothelial production of nitric oxide. So these metabolites are a mix of all sources of production of nitric oxide. And so you would have to interrogate each and do, prolonged fasting and do, endothelial function tests to really parse out where that nitric oxide is coming from or where your deficiency may be coming from.
So, to explain, we'll get into some of the functions of nitric oxide in a few minutes, but to explain the physiology of it, is nitric oxide production produced without eating foods that have nitrates?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the first pathway to be discovered was the recognition of the discovery.
The arginine, right?
Yeah, so there's an enzyme called nitric oxide synthase that's found in our endothelial cells. And that enzyme takes L-arginine, which is an amino acid, and through a 5-electron multi-step oxidation produces nitric oxide. And then the metabolite of that reaction is L-citrulline. So L-citrulline is a byproduct of nitric oxide production. It's not a precursor. And so that enzymology has been completely elucidated. And so we're never deficient in L-arginine. So it's never made sense to me as a biochemist why anyone would supplement L-arginine.
Okay, you're pointing out the fact that there are products on the market, and some of the first products that have been marketed to promote nitric oxide used L-arginine and or L-citrulline or both.
That's right. And so because people thought, well, if the body takes arginine and converts it to nitric oxide, if you're nitric oxide deficient, well, let's just give arginine. And early on, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that was a practical and rational thought. But we've learned so much more about the function of the NOS enzyme since then. Now we find that if the NOS enzyme is uncoupled and not functional, and you supplement with high dose arginine, you can actually cause more harm than provide benefit. And this is demonstrated in post-infarct patients where given L-arginine actually increased mortality and morbidity in post-infarct patients. And you had the same thing with patients with peripheral artery disease.
So explain how that production of nitric oxide is harmful, because you're producing nitric oxide that, did you say it's uncoupled?
Yeah, so the enzyme is uncoupled.
Okay.
So what happens so the NOS enzyme is we call it a homodimer. So it's two twins that come together that allow for this transfer of electrons from the oxidase to the reductase domain, because it has to oxidize a 5-electron oxidation of what we call the guanidino-nitrogen of arginine. And so if this enzyme is uncoupled, then there's a disruption in the flow of electrons. And what happens is we reduce molecular oxygen into superoxide radical. So you can exacerbate the oxidative stress. So instead of producing nitric oxide, you're producing superoxide, which is an oxygen radical. It steals electrons, causes oxidation, and oxidative stress is the root and hallmark of many chronic diseases. So you're actually getting the opposite of the intended effect.
Now, what if you consume antioxidants at the same time as you consume arginine or citrulline to bind up that reactive oxygen species?
Well, there's two things we have to address. Number one is prevent the oxidation of tetrahydrobiopterin. That's the rate limiting step in NOS uncoupling. But so the answer to your question is maybe, because you have to understand the electrical potential that's needed to extract an electron from BH4. And that's why there's called redox coupling, right? Because the electrical potential or the redox potential for each molecule is different. The redox potential for glutathione is different than ascorbic acid, is different than alpha lipoic acid. And that's why there's always this transfer of electrons at this potential gradient that's required. So if you're not consuming the right antioxidants to provide an electrical potential to protect that electron from BH4, then you're not going to protect from NOS uncoupling. And then there's different antioxidants, whether water soluble, fat soluble, or enzymatic antioxidants that can scavenge superoxide and hydroxyl radical. So it's a very complex electrical system that you have to understand. But antioxidants, I think, in any regard, are typically good protective molecules. But it goes beyond that.
Right. So we have the one pathway, which is turning arginine through eNOS into nitric oxide. And then the other pathway comes from us eating food that contains nitrates, and the foods that are highest in nitrates are dark leafy greens and beets.
I mean, typically, there was a misconception of nitrate and nitrite over the past, probably 80 years, where it was, thought that nitrate cured meats like bacon, hot dogs, lunch meat would form nitrosamines and cause cancer. But we debunked that myth, probably 20 years ago. And now we find that the highest burden of exposure.
Wait, can it be that different, that a nitrate in bacon is different than a nitrate in a green leafy vegetables?
The same exact molecule.
It's the same molecule.
Molecule. Yeah.
Because I've noticed that some of the companies that make some of these cured meats now are adding nitrates from celery.
Yeah. No, look, it's really deceptive marketing, right? Because to cure a meat product, it requires nitrite. There is no substitute for it. So because, consumers were misled and misinformed, consumers were demanding a nitrite-free product. So what they're doing is they add cultured celery extract, then they add a starter culture of bacteria, nitrate-reducing bacteria. So the bacteria reducing the nitrate to nitrite, and nitrite's curing the meat. It's still nitrite-cured meat, but there's no nitrite itself added. They're doing it indirectly. But you've got to have nitrite present to cure meat and to prevent overgrowth of Clostridium and to ensure food safety,
Right.
In these cured meat products. But no, it's the exact same molecule. The matrix and the chemistry can be different because the antioxidant capacity of a green leafy vegetable is much different than a muscle matrix. But we know that in order for any nitride cured meat product, you have to have a super stoichiometrical amount of ascorbic acid, or in the meat industry, they use erythrobate. But it provides called an accelerant because it facilitates that one electron reduction of nitrite to nitric oxide and completely prevents any nitrosative chemistry.
Okay. So when we consume these nitrates in green leafy vegetables or beets, we convert it into nitrite, which then goes to the stomach. And if there's sufficient hydrochloric acid, then we produce nitric oxide. Is that how the cycle works?
That's in an ideal situation.
Okay.
But, there's problems at each step. So number one, and we published this in 2015, that depending upon the vegetable you eat and where that vegetable is grown and where you purchase it from is dependent upon the nitrate content, right? So just because you're eating spinach or beets, for example, are probably the worst source of inorganic nitrate. And somehow beets—
The worst source?
The worst. Especially the commercial beet products. I've tested all the commercial beet products on the market, and 95 to 98% of them contain no detectable nitrate.
Really?
Dead beets. In fact, we used them as placebos in our clinical trials because they're a great placebo. They provide zero nitric oxide benefit. And companies don't understand this. Well, some companies do, and they're deliberately defrauding and deceiving their customers. But a lot of these companies are buying the cheapest beet product on the market, putting it in a powder and calling it nitric oxide. Beets are not nitric oxide.
So does it depend on whether they're grown in soil that's fertilized with nitrogenous fertilizer?
Yeah, to make nitrate and to assimilate nitrate, you have to have nitrogen in the soil. And so it depends upon the soil conditions, the amount of lightning strikes per year, whether you add nitrogen-based fertilizers to the soil.
The number of lightning strikes?
Yeah, lightning fixes nitrogen. The atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, and that triple bond is a very strong bond. And so when you have lightning storms, it breaks that triple bond of nitrogen and fertilizes the soil. So you're getting nitrogen and usable forms of nitrogen. And that's why, the Rust Belt of the southern U.S. is some of the most fertile soil in the U.S. because of the number of lightning strikes.
Wow. Fascinating.
Yeah. So there has to be a certain threshold of nitrate that's necessary to see an effect. So that's number one. Number two is you must have the right oral bacteria, because humans cannot metabolize nitrate. So we're 100% dependent upon the oral bacteria. So if you're using fluoride toothpaste, if there's fluoride in your drinking water, if you're using an antiseptic mouthwash, then you eradicate these oral bacteria, and then you can consume spinach, beets, lettuce till the cows come home. But if you don't have the right bacteria, nitrite is excreted in the urine, it's excreted in the feces, and it's excreted in our sweat. So you get no benefit from it. And then the terminal step in this.
So you have to have a healthy oral microbiome, right?
Absolutely.
Now, to have a healthy oral microbiome, you have to have a lot of healthy bacteria, commensals, and you don't want a lot of pathogenic bacteria.
That's exactly right.
Can it be the case that some antimicrobials will kill the pathogenic bacteria, like say P. gingivalis, that you don't want? And couldn't that promote a healthier microbiome?
Well, I think that's the intent. But the reality is these antiseptics non-selectively kill all bacteria, right? There's no selection for P. gingivalis, but there's collateral damage. It's killing the pathogenic. It's killing the non-pathogenic commensal bacteria.
Does it matter what we use? Like, for example, there are herbal mouthwashes and toothpaste that say contain things like silver or antimicrobial herbs or coconut oil. Do any of these natural products promote a healthier microbiome of the mouth?
Well, let me tell you what we know, and I'll tell you what we don't know. Because we've learned a lot, but there's still a lot we don't know. And so I don't have the answer to some of those questions. But here's what we do know. We published this. If you use what's called an antiseptic mouthwash, whether it's chlorhexidine, scope, Listerine, It non-selectively kills all the bacteria. It basically wipes out all bacteria. And you've seen the commercials. It kills 99.99% of the bacteria in your mouth.
Right.
That's not a good thing, by the way. And they advertise this on TV, and I'm going, it's unbelievable. So that's what we know. Anything that's labeled antiseptic, believe it. It kills all bacteria, not just the pathogens. Now, what we don't know is, oil pulling, I think, is fine. Use of coconut oil. I don't know about certain herbal rinses or herbal toothpaste because we haven't done the studies to see, is it selectively killing pathogens and improving the diversity of the non-pathogenic commensals, which that's the goal.
Right.
I developed a toothpaste several months ago that it's pretty selective for the pathogens and then improves the diversity of the oral microbiome. So we've taken the fluoride out, we've put in prebiotics and things in there that can build up the ecology of the microbiome and improve diversity, improve nitric oxide production. And we're working on a mouth rinse now that we'll probably have out in the first quarter of 2026. Again, trying to selectively kill the pathogens, the gingival bacteria, the caries-causing bacterium, and improving the diversity of the non-pathogenic bacteria. Because what we're finding is, if you can increase the diversity of the microbiome, then the good guys are the cops and keep the bad guys at bay. But when you throw an atomic bomb in your mouth with chlorhexidine or fluoride or mouthwash, you're killing everything. And then many times the pathogens will outcompete the good guys. Then you've got complete dysbiosis, periodontal disease, gingivitis, prone to cavities, low salivary pH, and it's a recipe for disaster.
Let's see. I want to give you a hard time for a second about the fluoride. Now, fluoride has some antimicrobial properties, which is what you're focused on. Personally, I don't use fluoride or use it for my family, but there is an argument that fluoride promotes the mineralization of the enamel that makes the teeth stronger, and it prevents cavities for that reason.
Well, that's what we thought 100 years ago. But as the science advances, we have to make changes based on new understandings.
Okay.
There was a study by the National Toxicology Program, which is the gold standard. If there's ever a question about the toxicity of a molecule we're exposed to through food, diet, or environment, then it's the National Toxicology's responsibility to do dose escalation studies and define the levels of toxicity for fluoride. And so what we look at is risk benefit. What benefit is it providing and at what risk? And this National Toxicology Program, which, by the way, they delayed publishing this for 4 years because the industry wasn't ready for this data. What they found was there's really no benefit to fluoride in terms of remineralization of teeth. What's the risk? Well, it's a neurotoxin. It shuts down your thyroid function. It lowers IQ in kids by as much as 7 points. And it's an antiseptic. So if there's no benefit and it's all risk, that's a very easy quotient. And the policymakers and regulators should get fluoride out of everything we're exposed to. Remove it from toothpaste. Remove it from the water supply. 72% of the municipalities in the U.S. put fluoride in their drinking water. But now I think
didn't all this fluoride stuff start because they noticed that certain communities where there was a lot of fluoride in the water, that they had fewer dental problems?
Yeah, but look, when you look at epidemiological studies, there's always confounders. So it may be an association, but not causation.
Okay.
And so now it's recognized that it really provides no benefit. There are other remineralization molecules, hydroxyapatite, for example, and just a good whole food diet, remineralizing the teeth.
Right.
It's sufficient. There's no need for fluoride.
Right. It'd be more natural to have calcium as part of the mineral content of your teeth than fluoride anyway.
Yeah. And the reason they put it in the water supply is because it kills the bacteria in the pipes. Well, it kills the bacteria in our pipes, our GI tract, right? It kills the bacteria on our body when we bathe in it.
Right.
It's a toxic molecule. And I encourage people, get rid of fluoride, buy a fluoride-free toothpaste. And if you live in a city where they put fluoride in the drinking water, you're almost forced to buy a home filtration system to remove it.
Right. That's what we have. Is it beneficial to measure the microbiome of the mouth?
No, it is. We're working with some diagnostic companies now because most dental diagnostic companies are only looking for the pathogens. which is very important, right? If you have these pathogens, you have to get rid of them because the increased risk of, I think all-cause mortality, especially cardiovascular disease. So what we're trying to do is part of this diagnostic, let's not only look at the pathogens, but let's look at these nitrate reducers and see if we can selectively build up these populations, which will then eradicate the pathogens on their own. But, we do this in the research environment. We do tongue scrapings, we do full metagenomic analysis and genetic screening of these bacteria, but it's not available clinically or commercially.
We've been having a great discussion, but I just wanted to tell you about some new supplements that I'm pretty excited about. Nitric oxide, which we've been talking about on this podcast, is a crucial molecule. It's a potent signaling agent in our body. It's involved with energy production, heart health, longevity. Unfortunately, by the time you're age 40, your natural nitric oxide production has already dropped in half. That's where N101 steps in. From nitric oxide lozenges that supercharge your circulation and energy to beetroot-powered pre-workouts and skin creams that radiate vitality, the N101 supplements deliver science-backed wellness with every dose. Whether you're optimizing heart health, boosting performance, or upgrading your oral care with Cardio Smile toothpaste, N101 is your go-to for elevated living. Don't just age, upgrade, and get 10% off when you use the promo code Weitz10 at checkout. That's WEITZ 10 at checkout. And now back to our discussion. Is there a way to get beets that are higher in nitrates, or should we use a different vegetable? I noticed in one of your products, you have fermented beets.
Yeah. Well, no, that's the trick, right? Because again, nitrate is inert. And so we're dependent upon bacteria to convert this 2-electron reduction of nitrate into nitrite. So what we do with our beets, we take a superior source of beets, which is high in nitrate, and then we apply the bacteria.
Where do you get that source of beets that's high in nitrates?
Well, we have to control the soil conditions, and we have to control the environment. So we understand the soil conditions, the agronomy, to make a nitrate-enriched beet. But again, if we're just focused on nitrate, 90% of the population who would consume that product wouldn't get a nitric oxide benefit, because of the oral bacterial issue and the stomach acid issue. So what we do is, if your body can't make nitric oxide or convert nitrate to nitrite, then we've done it for you. So we've pre-converted this beets through fermentation. So now when you consume our beets, it's not dependent upon your oral bacteria. It's not dependent upon stomach acid production. We make nitric oxide for you. So everybody who takes our beet product gets a nitric oxide benefit. And
so when you ferment a beet, what happens to the beet?
Well, fermentation in general is a way to optimize certain nutrients. So you can ferment things and optimize certain nutrients. What we focus on is the fermentation process to convert nitrate to electron reduction to nitrite. So now we have a nitrite-enriched fermented beet powder.
I see.
You put it in solution and you take it systemic. When you drink it, it's producing nitric oxide gas. Whether you're taking, because we put electron donors in there that facilitate that 1 electron reduction of nitrite to nitric oxide. And that's what makes our technology different than all these other yahoos out there schlepping beetroot, is that most of them don't have any nitric oxide activity whatsoever. And ours, because I understand the science and the biochemistry, if your body can't make nitric oxide, then we do it for you.
Right. So rather than taking arginine and citrulline, rather than just taking some beetroot powder that may not have a high level of nitrate, you get a beet that's grown in soil conditions, so it's higher in nitrate to start with. Then you ferment it, so you're now converting some of the nitrate to nitrite, and then you also add nitrites to the product, correct?
No, we do like the meat companies. We're pre-converting this beet powder into usable forms that are direct. So there's no added nitrite.
Oh, okay.
We allow the natural process of the bacteria fermentation to provide it for you. But we can quantify this and we understand the chemistry and we can control that reaction to where every time you take a single serving of our meat, you're getting the same amount of nitric oxide. And it's an efficient delivery. And again, it's not dependent. It overcomes all the body's inherent limitations to produce nitric oxide and the reason why many people are deficient.
I see. But you also have a product that has sodium nitrite in it.
Yeah, so we make an orally disintegrating tablet that, I designed many years ago that releases a certain amount of nitric oxide over a certain period of time. This orally disintegrating tablet, you put it in your mouth, this matrix falls apart. Again, it's sodium nitrite with electron donors, and we're controlling the metabolic formation of nitric oxide gas. So it's releasing about 20 to 30 parts per million nitric oxide gas over 5 to 6 minutes. And that nitric oxide release from that lozenge is vasoactive. We can see dilation of the carotids within about 12 seconds. We see, dilation of other blood vessels. We see a reduction in inflammation. We see an improvement or an increase in the number of circulating stem cells after taking the lozenge. Within 20 minutes, we've improved endogenous production of nitric oxide by 20%. So it's more than delivering nitric oxide. It's providing antioxidant capacity that prevents BH4 oxidation and improves endothelial nitric oxide production. And because it resides in the mouth, it's completely restoring the oral flora. So our products, again, if your body can't make nitric oxide, we do it for you. But more importantly, I think, is it's repairing the body's ability to make nitric oxide on its own.
So if I wanted to take a nitric oxide product, say, before I go to the gym, is it better to take? Which one is it better to take?
We position the NO Beats powder as a pre-workout because, again, it's immediate release. As soon as you put in solution and you put in 2 to 3 ounces of water and you take it as a shot, it's not something you sip on through your workout. It has to be taken as a shot, as a bolus.
Okay.
But it generates nitric oxide. We put electrolytes in there to improve cellular hydration. And we also put a patented peak ATP in there. So, again, it produces mitochondrial ATP, the energy currency of the cell. So those three, improved hydration, improved nitric oxide, and improved ATP production, it's going to give you an incredible workout.
Cool. So let's go over some of the physiological benefits. Let's start with cardiovascular health and how nitric oxide plays a role in endothelial function and blood pressure.
Well, nitric oxide, when it's produced in the endothelial cells, again, it's a gas. So it diffuses into the lumen of the blood vessel, it diffuses into the underlying smooth muscle, and then it leads to vasodilation. When it diffuses into the lumen of the blood vessels, it downregulates adhesion molecules. So when we look at chronic disease and the vascular component of chronic disease, there's always vascular inflammation where monocytes and neutrophils start sticking. Your blood vessels become like Velcro. Platelets stick, monocytes stick, red blood cells stick.
Yeah, we measure markers of inflammation in the arteries. So we look at myeloperoxidase and we look at oxidized LDL and we look at hsCRP.
Yeah, so nitric oxide mitigates the inflammation that you see in vascular disease. In fact, it's the functional loss of nitric oxide in the lining of the blood vessels that's the earliest event in the onset and progression of vascular disease. So when you can't make nitric oxide, you get an upregulation of adhesion molecules. Monocytes, neutrophils start to stick. They migrate through the endothelium. They develop foam cells. You start to develop myeloperoxidase. You get plaque instability, plaque rupture. And there's your heart attack or ischemic stroke. So if we can maintain adequate nitric oxide production, it leads to better vasodilation, downregulation of the adhesion molecules, so you don't get monocytes that adhere and extravasate through the endothelium, so you don't get plaque formation. And you're mobilizing stem cells. One of my patents on a method of reducing C-reactive protein. So even the acute phase markers of inflammation, if we give nitric oxide, we see a reduction in C-reactive protein. We can look at intravital microscopy and look at the number of monocytes and neutrophils that are rolling and sticking to the endothelium, and it completely inhibits that. And then it's reducing oxidative stress, and it's correcting the immune dysfunction that we see in patients with cardiovascular disease.
And it reduces hypertension as well, correct?
Absolutely. So when you look at all the risk factors for developing cardiovascular disease, not just the risk factors, but the consequences, nitric oxide addresses all of them.
Can you ever have too much nitric oxide?
Of course. Yeah, so too much nitric oxide will lead to systemic vasodilation, loss of perfusion pressure, and you may get syncope or lightheaded. And then the only other sign of toxicity is what we call methemoglobinemia. So too much nitric oxide will oxidize the heme iron of hemoglobin, form methemoglobin, and then you reduce the oxygen carrying capacity of the red cell, and you become cyanotic, and you lose the ability to deliver oxygen.
So what can
typically blood pressure will fall long.
What can lead to too much nitric oxide?
What leads to too much?
Yeah.
There's really not a clinical condition where there's too much nitric oxide.
Okay.
It was once thought that sepsis, the end organ failure you see in septic patients,
right,
was due to too much nitric oxide being produced by our immune cells that causes systemic vasodilation, loss of perfusion pressure, end organ failure, and death. So in the 90s, they did a clinical trial where they gave nitric oxide inhibitors to inhibit nitric oxide production by our immune cells. And it's an analog of arginine. So it's a competitive inhibitor to arginine. What they found was in that double-blind placebo-controlled clinical study, the septic patients who were administered a NOS inhibitor got worse. Again, more people died from giving the NOS inhibitor than the placebo. So that told the entire field that nitric oxide, the overproduction of nitric oxide in sepsis, isn't a cause of death. It's probably a protective mechanism. And when you shut that down, patients get worse.
How does nitric oxide influence brain health and cognition?
Well, when we look at neurological disease, take dementia and Alzheimer's, for example, we know that there's a vascular and metabolic component. In fact, Alzheimer's has been called diabetes type 3. So in all these neurological conditions, if you follow the work of Daniel Amen, he shows through SPECT scans there's focal ischemia. There's a lack of blood flow to certain regions of the brain. So what does nitric oxide do? It acts as a vasodilator, opens up the blood vessels, both the conduit blood vessels, the micro blood vessels, and it perfuses the brain. So now you're getting adequate oxygen delivery to those cells and they can actually work. And then the other aspect of that is the cells become insulin resistant. And that's why it's called diabetes type 3 or Alzheimer's. And so what nitric oxide does, and we were the first group to publish this in 2011, nitric oxide is the signal in the cell that allows for glucose uptake. So when insulin binds to the insulin receptors on cells, it starts an intracellular signaling cascade that's dependent upon the cell's ability to make nitric oxide. When nitric oxide is produced in the cells, it binds to a cysteine residue on GLUT4, which then tells that protein to go to the membrane and bring glucose in so that cell can actually make ATP and cellular energy from glucose. So if the cell can't make nitric oxide, you develop insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. So if you give nitric oxide, and we've got a drug study, an FDA drug study, where we're working on a nitric oxide drug for Alzheimer's. If you give nitric oxide to a patient with vascular dementia or Alzheimer's, we improve blood flow, we improve glucose uptake, overcome insulin resistance, and their cognition improves. And when you enhance perfusion and enhance cell function, you don't get misfolding of proteins. So you don't get. Is there
a way to direct the nitric oxide focus on the brain? Is there a delivery system or something that can facilitate nitric oxide in the brain?
No, I mean, nitric oxide is a gas, right? It diffuses right through the blood-brain barrier. It's a gas that diffuses across cell membranes. But, if you've got Alzheimer's or vascular dementia, it's not a unique disease to the vascular bed of the brain. It's a systemic disease, right? So you've got microvascular dysfunction and insulin resistance in every vascular bed in the body, in the heart, the sex organs. And so if you look at all the risk factors that accelerate and put people more prone to Alzheimer's, it's diabetes, it's hypertension, it's erectile dysfunction, it's insulin resistance. I mean, all those are symptoms of nitric oxide deficiency. So disease manifests differently in different organ systems in different people based on, genetic predispositions, their diet, their lifestyle, and that's how it manifests.
So you don't think there would be benefit to some route of getting the nitric oxide to be produced directly in the brain?
No, I don't, because what we try to do as a drug company is recapitulate physiology.
Okay.
I don't want to disrupt what the body's trying to do, but it's just lost its ability to do.
Okay.
When we develop drug therapy or product technology, I want to deliver a certain amount of nitric oxide over a certain period of time. And I want to control and dictate the metabolic fate of where nitric oxide goes, what it becomes, and how it signals, to basically recapitulate what it would naturally do if that patient was able to make nitric oxide. And that's why the technology we've developed is so unique and innovative, because it's basically mimicking what the body normally does. And so, we're a drug company, we call it a biotech company, but we don't employ pharmacology. Pharmacology is a synthetic compound that inhibits a biochemical reaction to which there's always side effects to. What I've tried to do over the past 30 years is understand the mechanism of disease to the extent that you can start to develop rational therapy. And fortunately for us, we know how nitric oxide is made, at what rate it's produced, its natural flux. And so we call this restorative physiology. And that's the medicines that we're trying to produce, because we want to mimic physiology, overcome the body's deficiencies, give the body what it needs, and let the body do its job.
So that's really a nutraceutical versus a drug, or I've heard you use the term nitraceutical.
The nutraceutical, yeah, I coined that term years ago, and we trademarked it because it was a way to differentiate our products from all these other, nitric oxide products that don't work and can't work. So yeah, we have nutraceuticals on the market, but what we're doing through our drug company is developing drug therapy. So we're taking what we call a supplemental dose, is kind of giving. So we have to do some simple arithmetic, right? And give a supplemental dose. And so the analogy I use is vitamin D. If you've got a vitamin D level of 30, then we can dose till we get you to 80 or optimal, right? So in nitric oxide, because we can't measure it, we've got to look at kind of normal dietary patterns, endothelial nitric oxide production, radiolabeled isotopes from arginine to citrulline, and then we get a number. So we have to supplement what's missing in a normal dietary pattern, and we can't go above that. Those are FDA guidelines for dietary supplements. Now, for drug therapy, what do we have to do? We have to demonstrate safety, and we have to demonstrate efficacy. And so we can increase the dose that's still safe, but the dose of nitric oxide that's needed to treat a patient with ischemic heart disease or Alzheimer's or heart failure is much different than what's needed to supplement people that are asymptomatic, is restorative. And so that's what we're doing in terms of our drug therapy, is increasing the dose for a specific indication that we can show safety and efficacy. And then we'll have our drugs approved and on the market.
Interesting. So nitric oxide plays a role in sexual function for both men and women.
Absolutely. And that's the mechanism of action of the drugs like Viagra and the PD-5 inhibitors.
Right. So would it be better to take those drugs and to use supplements to increase nitric oxide?
No, absolutely. Not just scientifically, but clinically, because those drugs, they were approved in 1998. They've been on the market now for, 27 years. They only work in 50% of the men, right? So 50% of the men that are prescribed Viagra, Cialis, these PD-5 inhibitors, respond with better erections. And why do 50% of the people not respond? Is because they're not making enough nitric oxide in the endothelial cells to activate guanylate cyclase to increase cyclic GMP. So nitric oxide is produced, increases cyclic GMP. These PD-5 inhibitors degrade cyclic GMP, and then the signal goes away. But if you give a PD-5 inhibitor, nitric oxide is produced, cyclic GMP increases, you prevent the breakdown of cyclic GMP, and that's why sometimes there's a 4-hour erection, which isn't a good thing, right? You get necrosis, your organ will die. Yeah. So if to answer your question, if we, in the non-responders, if we improve nitric oxide production through our supplemental dose, we activate guanylate cyclase. Now these non-responders respond to PD-5 inhibitor therapy, and you can actually lower the dose, making these drugs safer, more effective, because they're dependent. So erectile dysfunction is a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. Right. And if we improve nitric oxide production, we improve vasodilation, we improve sexual performance, we improve cognitive performance, we improve athletic performance.
Interesting. So let me just summarize what you just said. These drugs like Viagra and Cialis, they inhibit the breakdown of the nitric oxide formation enzymes, right?
Now, what they do is they prevent the breakdown of cyclic GMP. So nitric oxide, cyclic GMP is a second messenger that's dependent upon nitric oxide. Okay. So if you make nitric oxide, you increase cyclic GMP. Okay. When cyclic GMP is degraded, you lose the vasodilation, the signal turns off.
I see. So they prevent the breakdown.
Yeah, then you potentiate that signal. And that's why you get sustained vasodilation. And look, these drugs have been, they were first developed for pulmonary hypertension or coronary artery disease. And now there's data showing that people who are on low-dose Cialis have a lower incidence of Alzheimer's. because we're improving cerebral blood flow. We're potentiating the signaling aspects of nitric oxide. But to answer your question, again, understanding physiology and employing these principles of restorative physiology, there's not a condition of overactive phosphodiesterase enzyme. So if you just improve nitric oxide production, let the signaling cascade and second messenger system take care of itself, you get adequate vasodilation, you can get an adequate erection in both men and women and overcome sexual dysfunction.
Yeah, I feel the same way about like the SSRI drugs for depression. You've got a drug that's keeping serotonin around, but if the body's not making enough serotonin to begin with, it's less likely to be effective.
For sure. And when you inhibit an enzyme that's normally active in the human body, there's always consequences. And you look at the side effects of SSRIs, I mean, it's a laundry list. But again, it's always risk-benefit. What benefit is it providing and at what risk?
Why does nitric oxide production decline as we age?
Well, I think it's the American lifestyle. It's the food we eat. It's the lack of physical exercise. It's the complete eradication of the oral and gut microbiome, causing dysbiosis. It's an inflammatory diet. Glyphosate on the food completely shuts down nitric oxide production, kills the bacteria, disrupts the enzyme. Now data showing that certain frequencies like 5G, provide a frequency of energy that completely disrupts the flow of electrons through the NOS enzyme and can lead to NOS deficiency.
Let's see. I heard you talk about the seed oil controversy. So this is much debated, in the nutrition world. Seed oils are these oils, basically vegetable oils that were promoted originally to have us stop using butter and saturated fats to try to reduce heart disease. And now they've gotten to a point where a lot of people feel that they're really bad for health, but not all the data really shows it. They're all that bad for health. And of course, they're all different. They're made in different ways. And some people say they're bad because they have omega-6, because omega-6 is inflammatory and omega-3 is anti-inflammatory. But, it's not that simple. And there's benefits to omega-6s too. So it's kind of a complicated situation, even though we love to reduce it to one phrase that you can put on a billboard.
Yeah, look, it's never that simple. But look, let's go back. The premise for doing that was flawed. Number one, cholesterol and fat does not cause heart disease. So eliminating it and trying to provide an alternative was the wrong premise, and they were chasing the wrong target. But if you just look at regular cell biology, right, the cell membrane is made up of fat and cholesterol. And it's a phospholipid bilayer. And there has to be fluidity to that cell membrane. So when a cell reacts to its external environment and it binds to receptors on the outside, which then initiate, most of the time it's a 7-transmembrane receptor that starts an intracellular signaling cascade. But if you would get your cholesterol too low, or you've got these inflammatory seed oils in there, you lose that intracellular signaling. The other thing is this is like a capacitance or capacitor, because the inside of a cell is usually minus 25 millivolts with respect to the outside of the cell. And if you lose that electrical capacitance, then you lose the electrical potential of the cell. Then the other thing is you completely disrupt intracellular signaling. And so that's why we have to focus on, providing the body with good fats. It can make good phospholipids that maintain some membrane fluidity, and cholesterol is part of that equation. And when you disrupt that and put these inflammatory, fats and lipids in there, then you completely change the cell biology, you completely change the cell potential, and you lose intracellular signaling. And that's, sets the cell up to become dysfunctional. If that cell becomes dysfunctional, the tissue becomes dysfunctional, the organ becomes dysfunctional, and there you go.
Now, the argument is made that saturated fats are inflammatory and increase heart disease because they increase LDL particle number increase. They increase the risk of heart disease. They're not the only thing involved. You have to have inflammation, oxidation, things like that. But That's the argument for reducing saturated fats.
Yeah, well, that's a flawed argument. All you got to do is look at the science. I mean, you can look at the epidemiological data from lowering cholesterol and lowering LDL. There's no benefit in primary, secondary, tertiary prevention trials in tens of thousands of patients. And so, if cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease, lowering cholesterol will not affect heart disease. And that's exactly what we've seen over the past 30 years. In fact, the rate and incidence of heart disease has increased with the use of statin therapy. And yet, there's some cardiologists who they want to put statins in drinking water and get everybody's cholesterol below 200. So you can't make vitamin D, so you become immunocompromised. Men can't make testosterone. Women can't make estrogen. And it's the perfect recipe for being dependent upon drug therapy for the rest of your life, which is the goal.
I think the way it's seen is, even by, say, more modern thinkers, is you need two things to happen. You have to have a lot of LDL and you have to have inflammation and oxidation. So if we reduce the oxidation and inflammation and we reduce the LDL, aren't we better off?
Well, no, for sure. Look, it's the inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction that cause chronic disease.
Right.
So, yeah, if you've got a lot of oxidative stress, I would argue that the body increases cholesterol in response to inflammation. So people who inflame typically have higher cholesterols, but that's a protective mechanism. And that would be like blaming fire trucks on the fire, right? Because fire trucks always show up at the fire, but did the fire trucks cause the fire?
Right.
I mean, it's a misinterpretation. It's a gross misinterpretation of data. I spent 25 years in academia, published over 100 peer-reviewed papers, and I reviewed thousands of papers that people were trying to publish. And I never argue with the data because the data are the data. The problem is the misinterpretation of that data. And that's the dangerous proposition that we deal with in the published literature, because today you can find whatever you want to in the published literature.
What are some of the other lifestyle factors that increase nitric oxide production, say exercise?
Yeah, for sure. Exercise. I mean, that's why exercise is medicine, because it stimulates and activates nitric oxide production. Sunlight, 20, 30 minutes of sunlight exposure, both on both ends of the kind of the visible spectrum. UV radiation can cleave nitric oxide bound to cysteine thiols. The full infrared spectrum, certain wavelengths can release nitric oxide that was been bound to metals and liberate that nitric oxide for vasorelaxation and vasodilation. What else? Elimination of sugar from your diet.
Okay.
That's kind of the biggest culprit, because anything that leads to an increase in blood sugar, sugar is sticky. Glucose is sticky, and it sticks to proteins and, locks it in a
glycosylation.
Of course, that's what hemoglobin A1C is. It's you're quantifying how much sugar is stuck to hemoglobin.
Right.
And it sticks to nitric oxide synthase. And, and when I see, all these beet products out there that are, got 4 grams of sugar and all this added sugar in these hydrated gel matrix and trying to, it would be comical if it wasn't dangerous, because
what's a hydrated gel matrix?
You see these things that are advertised on TV with these beets, and I see it all the time. It's made of seed oil and sugar. They're putting beets in seed oil and sugar, and I cannot think of a worse idea for human health.
Is any fermented beet product better, or only if the beets are really grown in high nitrogen soil?
Well, no. If you focus on, you got to have a substrate or starting material to ferment, to concentrate those metabolites. If there's no nitrate in that beet product to start with, you can add starter cultures of bacteria all day long, but there's nothing to convert.
Right. So the beets have to be grown in soil that's higher in nitrogen,
Exactly.
But some nitrogenous fertilizers are not necessarily healthy either, right? They're very...
Well, look, what you have to do is, you have to do a soil analysis.
Right.
And there's data showing from the 1940s to the 2010s, there's 78% less basic micronutrients in the soil in America, America's farmlands. And so what we have to do is we have to do a soil analysis when we grow our vegetables and figure out what are the basic missing nutrients from that soil. And then you got to replete it. You have to fertilize. If it's deficient nitrogen or phosphorus or potash or we've got to put it back in there. If the soil is too acidic, we got to add lime to it. If it doesn't have, selenium, chromium, and the right bacteria to these nitrogen fixing bacteria, then you got to, add these bugs to the soil. But, that's a whole field of agronomy that's very complex science, but, soil need nitrogen. So for instance, I have 800 acres out here in Texas. We raise our own beef and we grow our own vegetables. But every couple of years, I'll take a soil sample, take it to the USDA office, and they'll tell me what my soil sample needs, what it is, and what it's missing. And then I make a custom fertilizer and I add it to the soil. But it's nitrogen-based fertilizers. Typically, it's a 28, 14, 7, 3.5, with this 3.5 being sulfur. And then that provides the nutrients that it needs. But the vegetables that I grow and eat personally are not considered organic because we've had nitrogen-based fertilizers to it. But there are no herbicides, there are no pesticides. So what we grow is a nutrient-rich, nutrient-dense, pesticide, herbicide-free vegetable, which is exactly what you want. But it's not organic.
So you can't do that with organic.
Now, organic, to get an organic label in the U.S., you can't add herbicides or pesticides, but they don't allow you to add nitrogen-based fertilizers to the soil. I mean, you need nitrogen to assimilate most nutrients in a soil.
Is there any way to naturally add it if you're an organic farmer?
Well, no, you can. You add manure, right? Whether you add compost,
right,
or you add, chicken litter or cow manure,
which is probably what organic farmers are doing anyway, right?
Yeah, but again, there's no standardization.
Right.
Is there enough nitrogen in that compost to lead to, any assimilation and accumulation in the soil? Because it's not measured.
Right. Interesting. Should we take a probiotic for the mouth to increase the healthier microbiome of the mouth?
The answer is yes, but the reality is there's not an oral probiotic commercially available that's designed to restore this flora. We discovered this back probably 10 or 12 years ago. I filed a number of patents because we identified the bacteria that were necessary and sufficient for adequate nitric oxide production. And then I went to the FDA because we were going to develop this as a prebiotic or probiotic.
Okay.
In the FDA's infinite wisdom at the time, they says, look, you need long-term safety studies on these non-pathogenic commensal bacteria before you bring it to market. Maybe I should have called it a vaccine and then they wouldn't want safety data on it.
We won't go there.
The games people play.
Great. So there's been a fascinating discussion. How can listeners and viewers find out more about your products and what you're up to?
Well, I try to direct everybody to my latest book, The Secret of Nitric Oxide, Bring the Science to Life, because this really tells the 30-year journey in the nitric oxide field, what it is, what it does, how it's produced, and what you may be doing to disrupt it naturally.
When was that book published?
I launched this, I believe, in February or March. I was on Fox and Friends. We did a nationwide media tour on it. So it's a new book, probably 6 months old now.
Cool.
And then I refer people to my YouTube channel. Subscribe, Dr. Nathan S. Bryan, Nitric Oxide on YouTube. I'm on Instagram, Dr. Nathan S. Bryan, LinkedIn. And then for those interested in the product technology, we're at n101.com. That's the letter N, number 1, letter O, number 1.com.
Now, is this a product that practitioners can carry as well?
Yeah, we have a direct-to-consumer business, but we also, support our medical practitioners where they get a wholesale and then they can resell it to their patients at a price that's reduced from what the consumer can buy direct from us. So we incentivize, patients to go to their provider, and because they can get the product cheaper from them than they can coming direct to us.
Is it available on FullScript?
Not yet. We're working on FullScript, but we're trying to get this and make it simple for practitioners to have, for their patients to have easy access to the product.
Right. That's great. So once again, the name of your product is N101?
Yes, it's n101.com. So for nitric oxide, 1 nitrogen, 1 oxygen, nitric oxide.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bryan.
Thank you, Ben. Good seeing you.
Thank you for making it all the way through this episode of the Rational Wellness Podcast. For those of you who enjoy listening to the Rational Wellness Podcast, I would very much appreciate it if you could go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a 5-star ratings and review. As you may know, I continue to accept a limited number of new patients per month for functional medicine. If you would like help overcoming a gut or other chronic health condition and want to prevent chronic problems and want to promote longevity, please call my Santa Monica Weitz Sports Chiropractic and Nutrition office at 310-395-3111, and we can set you up for a consultation for functional medicine. And I will talk to everybody next week.